the stories of our children getting opportunity to go to college and about mamas and daddies putting nickels and dimes and quarters together to pay tuition. It's about our stories. It's about the hardships and the pain and the suffering. It's about the protests and the marching. It's about the standing. It's about the legislation. It's about all of that. It's our story.
Witness to Grace, a testimony of favor, is a poignant, true life story that chronicles the remarkable journey of W. Franklyn Richardson, from humble and challenging beginnings to honored positions of power and global influence. Witness to Grace gives an intimate portrayal of the rise of one of the most respected religious and civil rights leaders of our time.
Hello, I'm Bishop Talbert Swan, pastor of the Spring of Hope Church of God in Christ. And my guest today is Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson. He is the proud pastor of the Grace Baptist Church in Mount Vernon, New York. And we're here to talk to him about the release of his new book, Witness to Grace, a testimony of favor. And Dr. Richardson, you know, I was so excited when I got my copy sent to me in the mail and began to read about it here. What prompted you to write this book and at this particular time?
Well, you know how you go along in your life and you keep saying you got to write some things down. And finally, I had major surgery about 3 years ago, which has turned out to be wonderful. I decided that I needed to take it more seriously because I really wanted to document my journey. I wanted to share it with the generations coming after me. I wanted to reflect on with my colleagues because I have benefited from so many who passed on to me. And so I felt an obligation. So I began to reflect at that time. I had opportunity to reflect. And as I began to reflect, the thing that became most predominant in my reflection was the fact, an obvious presence and hand of God's grace in the unfolding of my journey. Not just the grace that showed on the mountaintops, but the grace that showed more importantly in the valleys. Not just the peaks, but the pits. And it is in those places that I saw the grace of God. And I chose to write the book through the prism of God's grace and owning that as the single most important thing that I had to say is that when you live your life, no matter whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, your life is escorted by the grace of God just by being a human being. That the sun, the moon, the stars, the breeze, life itself is a gift of God's grace. And to have also salvation is over the top. So it was a wonderful entree to go back over my journey. I made some discoveries of myself. I tried to be transparent. I tried to be accurate, and it turned out to be a real important journey for me. And I found, as it has been shared, that many people are tying into it because young people, not just preachers, but young people who are caught in the beginnings of their lives with limited resources, as I did. But by God's grace, you can rise above your circumstance. You can overcome so many things. Yeah. And that's really what the message is for our young people. Be encouraged, stay focused, work hard, and at the end, the grace of God will deliver you.
Now, you wrote it through the prism of God's grace. Of course, talk about how God's grace has resonated in your life. And it's no coincidence that you're the longtime pastor of Grace Baptist Church. So there's a lot to do with God's grace. What are some of the key themes in the book that you're trying to get across to your reading audience?
Well, you're right about the fact it's a coincidence that God's grace, I guess that has been my escort every Sunday morning for 50 years, 45 years anyway. But I began by reflecting in my own journey. You know, the fundamental entrance of my life is affected by it because my dad was born in Columbia, South Carolina. And at the age of 15, he had to leave South Carolina under the cover of night. The Ku Klux Klan was after him for a misspoke to a white woman. He was accused of that. And he ended up in Baltimore in a situation with a bad guy who he had got out of South Carolina with. His father, a friend of his father, who was my grandfather, who had also left prior to that, his friend called him and said, "Your boy's hanging out with the wrong fella. I don't think he's gonna have a great future." And my grandfather said, "Send the boy to me." And you see, if my dad had 15 years old with no job, no resources, no guidance, he could have been destroyed that night, and there wouldn't be no me. My granddaughter said, "And me neither, Papa." So the whole enterprise of my journey begins as a gift of God when I reflect upon it. And then I went on. I grew up in Philadelphia. I had a pleasant, my greatest escort in life was my mother, who led me to a relationship with God that has been such a reward in my journey. And then I ended up going, I was in West Philadelphia High School, and in Philadelphia back in those days, Doc, you get social promotion. Mm-hmm. If you just be good and keep quiet, don't get no trouble, you get to the next grade, whether you are being competently prepared or not. Well, by the time I got to 10th grade, I did want to be a doctor, and the counselor told me I wasn't college material, a white gentleman. And so I didn't take his word for it. When I graduated from high school, I enrolled at West Philadelphia High School, West Philadelphia Community College. And there I flunked out of community college. I later accepted my call to ministry and told my dad, told my pastor that I wanted to be a prepared preacher. He said, well, I told him, I said, I flunked out of college. He said, well, I want to recommend you to Virginia Union, and I'll write a letter and we'll see what happens. Well, Virginia Union examined me and decided that I had a reading impairment, that I couldn't read. And they said, well, we will take you on a conditional matriculation, put you in remediation for a year. If you do well, you can stay. And by God's grace, I did well, graduated, went on to Yale Divinity School and went on doctorate degree, general secretary, did all the stuff around the world. And 35 years later, a kid who had a conditional matriculation is now the chairman of the board and signs every degree of everybody who graduates. Wow. Now that is a testimony of favor. That is a gift of God's grace.
Wow.
And I saw that evolve.
Wow, that's quite a story of God's grace happening right there. Yes. You kind of skimmed over, 35 years later. There's a lot packed in there in terms of what you've done and what you've accomplished. But one of the things that I note, and you mentioned a little earlier when you talked about young people, I was reading the foreword here on one of your spiritual sons and a friend of mine who actually used to pastor literally down the street from where I am, Dr. Howard John Wesley. And he talks about in that foreword of how when he was a young boy, his father sent him to shadow you when you were the general secretary of National Baptist Convention, and what a profound impact that had on his life. How important has it been in your journey to touch and impact the lives of young people and to pass down your experience and your wisdom to the next generation?
Well, Bishop, the reason I value it is because it had such an impact on me. My whole journey has been impacted by mentors of grace that God has put along my way. Every step, everything I accomplished, I can point to some person, some mentor who opened a door or gave encouragement or picked me up or gave me direction. And it's so valuable in my life that I felt that I have a responsibility to pass it on, to pay forward to those who are coming behind. And I believe that one of the things we've got to hold on to in the Black church and among Black pastors, we got to hold on to the mentoring obligation and expectation that we as pastors have known across the years. You cannot learn how to be a pastor in the seminary.
Mm.
You can get foundational equipment, but you cannot learn. There's such a thing as a pastoral practitioner. You only get to be a pastor as you practice pastoring. And if you can benefit from the experiences of those who came before you and find mentors, you can do it so much more effectively. So in the pastorate, there is that. But also it's true about young Black men and women. We need inspiration. We all have our challenges. All of our sons and daughters have our challenges. And in this book, I try to communicate that don't let your challenges take you out. Don't let what you're going through, because what you're going through, if you hold on, you may discover that it was not only it was not a setback, it was really a setup for God to do something even greater in your life.
Mm.
And you know, when you're going down the road of life, you go forward in anticipation, but it's in faith. You know, we look at the future and own the future by faith. But it's only when we look back over our shoulders can we see grace. We can only see grace looking back at how God's fingerprint was on us. Didn't understand when we were passing through it. But where we are now, we understand that he was already ahead of us. And what we thought was a disappointment was just a displacement for us to be in a better situation.
I mean, the title of the book, it speaks volumes, Witness to Grace. When you look at where you've been, the seats that you sat in, the people that you've been brought in front of, have you ever just really looked back and said, wow, how did I end up here? And how was I worthy to be in this place that I'm in with the type of influence and the type of reach that I have when you look back from where you came from?
Doctor, you hit the nail right on the tail. It's every day. Every day I rejoice at what God has done, because I know it wasn't nobody but the Lord. I know I did what I could. I tried to stay focused, but I still have blessings, many blessings that were unearned. As a matter of fact, I have some blessings that I don't deserve. I have some blessings that I had nothing to do with, and they have all ushered me to where I am today. And so, you know, not look back sometime, I look back all the time.
Mm.
And I'm thanking God for doors that he's opened and ways that he's made and opportunities that he's given. And so I try to be the best I can. I'm a broken vessel, but I try the best I can to be a faithful steward of the opportunities that God has given me.
Yeah, well, you know, when you think about God's grace, that's his unmerited favor. That's his riches at Christ's expense. And so we often look at things that we have and where we are and know that we don't deserve to be there, but for the grace of God.
Yeah.
Over these many years as an activist and advocate for justice and for change in our nation, you've been involved in protest marches, advocating for many years. How does your faith and grace fit into this genre of advocacy?
Well, you know, I did not come to the pastorate with an intentionality of being a social activist or civil rights person. But I came to the ministry at a time in '68 when Martin Luther King was prominent in setting the tone of the church. Mm. And his emphasis on a social gospel early on captured my consideration. And so consequently, as I have gone forward from then, I had a view of the gospel, a prism of the gospel of Jesus Christ as a liberation tool. Mm-hmm. And so that social gospel dynamic affected my thinking about ministry, and then when I became acquainted intimately with the scriptures, I did not see how I could not be engaged as a voice against oppression and racism and discrimination. For me, it's an extension of authentic ministry. Mm. That to live in a world where racism is dominant and people are disadvantaged, and be a purveyor of the gospel of Jesus Christ and not engage yourself is a betrayal as far as I'm concerned. I don't know how you read the gospel and not get excited. I don't know how white evangelicals, I don't know their Jesus. Because the Jesus I know is a Jesus that calls us to engagement on behalf of the downtrodden, the oppressed, and to set the captives free. I don't understand. So for me, it has grown every year of my life, greater and greater understanding that that is one of the ultimate values of ministry and the opportunity to be a pastor.
What do we say in this day and age when you talk about the gospel as a liberation tool? And when we look at, as you mentioned, white evangelicals, when 10,000 white evangelicals sign a manifesto that says social justice is antithetical to Christianity, how do we respond to that type of teaching that is so pervasive in the church?
Well, that is not surprising. That they didn't get that this morning. That's been the continual posture. As a matter of fact, that line of Christianity was co-conspirator to our enslavement upon coming to this country. The white church is a co-conspirator to enslavement of African people, beginning at the Roman Catholic Church in the 15th century. And when blacks showed up in 1619 in America, the white church co-conspirated with the slave masters and the plantation owners and gave them warm welcome and embrace and affirmed their system of dehumanizing African people. And then today, they still provide hospitality to white supremacists and Ku Klux Klan members. They still are. So there's no transformation. That declaration of 10,000 years is consistent with where they have been. They never have understood Jesus's declaration in Luke 4 to set the captives free, to be at liberty, set at liberty those who are oppressed. They never heard that. They must have skimmed over all of that. They've been captured by the misinterpretation of slaves obey your master. And so their perspective is not akin to those who have persecuted our slave forefathers, fathers, and mothers in their slave camps. They met a Jesus who called them to full humanity and who called them to be free indeed. And so I understand the continuancy, but I don't understand how you can take the book and use it as your representation of your particularity. And so we have to do what we do. And that is we preach and we act out and we pray about liberation. And I say that when you pray on your knees, it is a mandate. Whatever you pray for on your knees gives you a mandate that when you get on your feet to act it out. So don't pray for what you're not willing to do after you get finished praying. And so we as African Americans, we pray for liberation. We pray for equality. So when we get up off our knees, we have to get on our feet and try to make it happen and participate in our own liberation.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about making it happen, in today's contemporary society, we are dealing, this has been a unique year like no other. We're dealing with dual pandemics. We're dealing with police and pandemic. We're dealing with COVID and cops. We're dealing with social injustice, as well as this major health crisis that's happening in our nation. And one of the things that has happened as a result of COVID-19, it has provoked questions and laid bare some of the systemic racial inequalities that exist in our nation. What are some of the most pressing questions that we need to answer today? And what are the solutions as we're dealing with this pandemic and the pandemic of racial injustice?
Well, one of the things happened to me was when I was writing the book and finished it and ready to send it out for release and publication, the pandemic reached a height in April. So the publication was shut down, distribution was shut down, and so the book was delayed. In the process of the delay, I started reflecting on where I was as I was seeing having 3 to 5 grief calls a day in the height of the pandemic in April.
Wow.
And I began to ask myself the question, where is the grace of God in the midst of this pandemic? And that led to other questions. Questions like, could it be that God was calling the whole creation into a reset, a refocus? That the pandemic had not affected anybody but human beings. The cows still were moving, dogs still barking, the moon still rising, the sun still moving, the cycle of the waves still moving. Could it be that we had come to a place of human corruption that was so acute that God had placed in our DNA in the founding of humanity, that if corruption got so bad, if the distribution of wealth got so out of balance, if the separation of humankind were diminished by barriers of race and nationalism, or that the circumstances become so bad that there will be an automatic kick in of this kind of override to keep us from self-destruction? Could it be that God is in the pandemic exercising grace in the face of what we had become as human beings, how we had become separated, how we had become even destroyers of the cosmos, that the climate and all of those things? Was this a statement of this? And then the question ultimately becomes, when this is over, do we just start back over, or do we start again?
Wow.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Do we just go on back to what we were doing, or do we take seriously how vulnerable we are, how fragile humanity is, and begin to live a different way and to value people in a different light? That, to me, is the function of grace in the pandemic. It was in the pandemic that we got great airing of the height of social inequity. We would never seen Floyd like we saw him, right, if it hadn't been for the pandemic. So, and that awakened corporate racial tension. How long it lasts, we will have to see. But the point is that the pandemic has some function. And where is God's grace? Is it that he's trying to save us from ourselves, from our self-destruction, and that this is an opportunity for us to reset? I kind of think it is. And so that's what.
You talked about not seeing what happened with George Floyd in the same light had we not been in the midst of this pandemic. And that literally stoked global outrage.
Yes.
The pandemic kind of changed the perspective of the world and made everyone look at certain issues. How do we fit into the world from a global perspective in terms of the racial inequities that we meet every day? Because we sometimes kind of deal with our things in an insular way in our own little pockets, but we saw a real connection globally, and some of the themes that you're talking about in the book have some global impact. So where do we fit in from a global perspective?
Well, from a church standpoint, or from the faith standpoint, we, one of the things that captured me early on in my career was ecumenism. And you and I are members of the Conference of Black Churches board, and we serve across denominations. For many years, I served on the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, which was 150 different countries, 400 million Christians. And it opened up my eyes to how we were different, but had similar hungers and notions. It also helped me to see that there are multiple windows within Christology, but also within the whole matter of spirituality, multiple windows of approaching God. And while the window I have found to approach him is Jesus Christ, and I'm adequately satisfied with my window, but I'm sure that there are other windows by which people see God. And I don't have the time, nor do I have the value, the drive to spend my limited amount of energy fighting people about the window that they see God in, if it's different from mine. If they have found adequacy in that window, God bless them. But if not, I invite them to come to my window because I know my window is valid.
Yes.
But the point that I'm trying to raise is that being a humanist has helped me to have tolerance and patience and affirmation of people who come to God through a different window than I am. And I think that that's what the world is hungering for. The denying of each other, the putting down people because of the color of their skin, or because of their different faith, or because of the fake borders of nationalism. I mean, pandemic showed us that national walls don't mean a thing.
Right.
Former president talking about putting up walls so people walk. Those walls mean nothing. The pandemic walked right through those walls, walked right through the classism, walked through racism. It walked through everything. So yes, I think that we are a global family, and that we are, and more we're going to have to move to that. We begin locally in our own local churches and our local camp. I think the vision for humanity is it's in the Greek word oikoumene, the house of God, that we are all in one house. We may be in different rooms, but the ultimate vision is that the partitions that separate us from each other in the hereafter, in the not yet, will collapse, and we'll all be in one room together. And we begin that today, and in our activities and these crises that we're facing. When we begin to see ourselves as partners and in life and in the world order, we'll have less wars, we'll have more equal distribution of food and wealth, we'll have the diminishing of, we'll have a saving of our climate. All of these things are integrated with our fundamental tolerance of each other.
Yeah. Now, one of the most poignant themes in your book, you deal with the obstacles that you had to experience, the heartbreaks, the setbacks, those types of things, being transparent with those issues. How does the sharing of those types of experiences help others that may be going through something similar, or even if they haven't experienced, may be on their way to something like that? Because oftentimes we like to talk about the victories in our lives, and be very secretive about the setbacks and the downfalls. How important was it for you to share those experiences?
Without that, Doc, this would just be a brag sheet. This book would be a brag sheet. Without that, without opening up and painfully revisiting my journey and sharing that, it is that gives the book authenticity. It is that makes it have value. Everybody know how to succeed on the valley, on the mountain. Everybody know how to handle, to celebrate prosperity and success. But the question, the function of faith is not to carry us on the mountains, but to give us capacity to go through the valley and to handle disappointment and brokenness and shatter and betrayal. We're able to do that because of our faith in God, and God holds us in the valley. And the truth is that our mountains and our valleys are juxtaposition to each other, and they're codependent.
Yeah.
You can't have a mountain without a valley. It is a valley that defines a mountain. And so for me to sit down and seriously reflect on my life and hold back the flaws and the mistakes and the disappointment is to leave out the real essence of my reflection.
So, of course, I've got to talk a little bit about this political season we've just gone through. We've been through a very tumultuous 4 years since 2016. And I don't know what people's particular political persuasion might be. I just remember vividly the level of depression that folks around me were in after the 2016 election. And as we've gone through this time, we kept asking the question, can things get any lower than they are now from the perspective of what was happening in Washington? And just when you think it would reach the bottom, that bottom would drop out and it would go even lower.
A new bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. How important was it for the Black church and Black people in particular to be engaged in the political process and civic engagement during this season? And how significant is it that right now the going debate is over swing states where Black votes in major cities determine the outcome of the election? And how significant is it for Black folks to understand the value of their vote and of their activity based upon that?
You know, Bishop, I think we got a real wake-up call, and the Lord woke us up.
Yeah.
We were asleep. We had 8 years of exceptional leadership by an African American man, and we thought, and immediately some of us thought that the battle was over, and we began to rejoice and celebrate, and we began to back up and become disengaged. When he was finished, we were at peace with what we had achieved and accomplished. And then came the next president, and he just showed us that we hadn't done anything. And he prompted us to re-engage. His activities did as much to bring out our vote as any of us did to try to get it out. And consequently, we have a fresh hour to begin again, which we would never have had if he had won a second term. So we have a marvelous opportunity. Black people did show up. Black people did realize a waking up and say, whoa, we thought we had passed this, and we saw with our eyes clarity. He couldn't have been a greater demonstration of the subtle hate that yet resides in the minds and hearts of some white people. He was a display. He was articulate at it. He was nasty. He was insulting. He was an affront to everything that was decent and dignified. And that drove us to come out, and we did corral. And it's right for him to feel that Black people put him out, because we did.
Yeah.
Put him out because he insulted us every day. Every morning he got up, he insulted us. He threatened to take away what we had achieved. He wanted to bring back what we thought we won back in the civil rights movement. And so we still gonna have to deal with the fallout of his 4 years. We're still gonna have to deal with what damage he did. We gotta do some repairing for what he's done. But thanks be to God that we had our eyes awakened and that we got back on the track. I hope we don't leave ever again. We've got to participate. We are important to the future of this nation.
Absolutely.
And our participation will determine what the outcome is going to be.
I look at you as an extension of the great pioneers of the civil rights movement, those great preachers who came before us, the Dr. Kings and his beloved community, and the Abernathys and the Jacksons, et cetera. How important is it for us to continue? Because a lot of times the younger generation thinks that those iconic figures and those who succeeded them are not relevant anymore in this day and age. Mm-hmm. How important is it for us to uphold the work that they did, how they pushed our community, and to get this generation to see that they are an extension of that work that was done prior to them coming along?
You know, what they saw in the last 4 years showed them how important it is that they had to be in the fight. Many of our Black young leaders and pastors in particular had started to shift to a prosperity mentality, to disengagement in social justice. They were sitting back and enjoying it. They did what you just said. They reflected on it as historical, that we were past that. Well, what we saw in the last 4 years has awakened a lot of young pastors, to Black pastors and some whites, to how important it is that we not go to sleep, that we remain engaged in the struggle for equality and justice for all people in this nation, all people in the world for that matter. And so, yes, I think you're right. I think we had young pastors, young generation, not just pastors, young people who thought that all they had to do now is climb the corporate ladder and be masters of the computer and the virtual activity, and they could be successful. But they are becoming clearly aware that there was operative in this nation a spirit that was designed to oppress them and hold them back. And if they failed to fight and participate, it would succeed. I think they saw that. And I'm encouraged by young people who are now standing up, speaking out. Black Lives Matter movement is essentially made up of millennials and Xers, and they're on fire. They don't necessarily do it the way we did it, but they still have the same fire in their bellies for equality and justice that Martin Luther King had, that before him Sojourner Truth had. It's been a legacy of protests against inequality that has been the mark of Black people's journey in this country. And I'm encouraged, Doc. I'm encouraged at this hour that we're gonna go forward.
Absolutely. If you had to give three things, there's so much that's in the book, but if you had to give three things that are in the book that you really want people to get out of it, what would those three things be?
Well, first of all, I would want them to understand how you can start at nothing, and by God's grace, you could achieve. I want them to know the importance of an education, the young generation, that we have to be a prepared people, that we cannot marginalize the importance of education, and where we have to preserve the historically Black colleges, because there are tremendous aid in getting us where we need to be, because they repair the damaged self-esteem that we receive as a part of racism in America. And then thirdly, I would want them to know and come to know the power of God in their lives, that God is real, that God can function to get you where you need to be, and he'll be there in your most difficult hour. If I had just had to pick three things, that would be the three that I would encourage us to embrace.
Dr. Richardson, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I want to thank you for making time today and having this conversation. And I want to encourage each of you that if you haven't got a copy of Dr. Richardson's book, Witness to Grace, A Testimony of Favor, you need to order a copy today on Amazon.com or anywhere where books are sold. You're not going to regret it. You're going to get a lot out of this book. So I encourage you to get it. Thank you so much, Doc. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Bishop. Appreciate you too. And keep doing what you're doing. We need your voice.
Witness to Grace, A Testimony of Favor is available for purchase. Get your copy today from Amazon,